A 78 tubular function. So as the glomerular filtrate enters the renal tubules, it flows sequentially through the proximal tubule first, then through the loop of Henle, the distal tubule, the collecting tubule, and finally the collecting duct before it is excreted as urine. So along this course, some substances are selectively reabsorbed from the tubules back into the blood, while others are secreted from the blood into the tubular lumen. Eventually, the urine that is formed and all the substances in the urine, they represent the sum of three basic renal processes: glomerular filtration, tubular reabsorption, and tubular secretion. So urinary excretion equals glomerular filtration minus tubular reabsorption plus tubular secretion. So for many substances, reabsorption plays a much important role than secretion in determining the final urinary excretion rate. However, tubular secretion accounts for significant amounts of potassium ions, hydrogen ions, and a few other substances that appear in the urine. So we are familiar with this formula. Filtration, that is U into V, is equal to GFR into P, because GFR or clearance is equal to UV by P. So this calculation assumes that the substance is freely filtered and not bound to plasma proteins. For example, you can see here, if the plasma glucose concentration is 1 gram per liter, the amount of glucose filtered each day is about 180 liters per day, GFR, into 1 gram per liter, or 180 grams per day. Because virtually none of the filtered glucose is normally excreted, the rate of glucose reabsorption is also 180 grams per day. So from this table, you can see right here these values. Two things are apparent. One thing is that the process of glomerular filtration and tubular reabsorption are these processes are quantitatively large relative to urinary excretion for many substances. This situation means that a small change in glomerular filtration or tubular reabsorption can potentially cause a large change in urinary excretion. For example, a 10% decrease in tubular reabsorption would increase the urine volume from 1.5 to 19.3 liters per day, meaning a 13-fold increase. 10% decrease in tubular reabsorption might cause a 13-fold increase in urine volume if the GFR remained constant. In reality, however, changes in tubular reabsorption and glomerular filtration are closely coordinated so that large fluctuations in urinary excretion are avoided. And second point is that unlike glomerular filtration, which is relatively non-selective, tubular reabsorption is highly selective. Some substances such as glucose and amino acids are almost completely reabsorbed from the tubule so that the urinary excretion rate is essentially zero. Many of the ions in the plasma such as sodium, chloride, bicarbonate are also highly reabsorbed, but their rates of reabsorption and urinary excretion are variable depending on the needs of the body. Waste products such as urea and creatinine conversely are poorly reabsorbed from the tubules and are excreted relatively in large amounts. So now coming to tubular reabsorption, it includes both active and passive mechanisms. For a substance to be reabsorbed, it must first be transported across the tubular epithelial membranes into the interstitial fluid or interstitial space, and then through the peritubular capillary membrane, it needs to enter back into the blood. Thus, reabsorption of water and solutes includes a series of transport steps. So the reabsorption across tubular epithelium into the interstitial fluid happens by the same mechanisms that we have already discussed. For instance, water and solutes can be transported either through the transcellular route, which is through the cells, or the paracellular route, which is through the spaces between the cell junctions, as you can see here. Then after absorption across the tubular epithelial cells into the interstitial fluid, the water and solutes are transported into the through the peritubular capillary walls into the blood by ultrafiltration or bulk flow that is mediated by hydrostatic and colloid osmotic forces. The peritubular capillaries behave like the venous ends of most other capillaries because there is a net reabsorptive force that moves the fluid and solutes from the interstitium back into the blood. Coming to active transport, it can move a solute against an electrochemical gradient and requires energy that is derived from metabolism. Transport that is coupled directly to an energy source, such as the hydrolysis of ATP, is termed primary active transport. One example is the Na plus K plus ATPase or sodium potassium pump that functions throughout most parts of the renal tubule. Transport that is coupled indirectly to an energy source, such as that due to an ion gradient, is referred to as secondary active transport. Reabsorption of glucose by the renal tubule is an example of secondary active transport. Although solutes can be transported by active or passive mechanisms, water is always reabsorbed by only a passive or non-active physical mechanism called osmosis, which means water diffusion from a region of low solute concentration or high water concentration to one of high solute concentration or low water concentration. Solutes can be transported through epithelial cells or between cells. See, renal tubular cells, like other epithelial cells, are held together by tight junctions. Lateral intercellular spaces lie behind the tight junctions and separate the epithelial cells of the tubule. Solutes can be reabsorbed or secreted across the cells through the transcellular pathway or between the cells by moving across the tight junctions and intercellular spaces by the way of the paracellular pathway. Sodium is a substance that moves through both routes, although most of the sodium is transported through the transcellular pathway. Okay. In some nephron segments, especially in the PCT, water is also reabsorbed across the paracellular pathway, and substances dissolved in the water, especially K+, Mg+2 and Cl- ions, are carried with the reabsorbed fluid between the cells. Primary active transport through the tubular membrane is linked to hydrolysis of ATP, as we already know. The special importance of primary active transport is that it can move solutes against an electrochemical gradient. The energy for this active transport comes from hydrolysis of ATP by way of membrane-bound ATPase, which is also a component of the carrier mechanism that binds and moves solutes across the cell membranes. The primary active transporters in the kidney that are known include Na plus K plus ATPase, H plus ATPase, H plus K plus ATPase, and calcium ATPase. A good example you can see here for the sodium potassium pump. So on the basolateral sides of the tubular epithelial cells, you can see the sodium potassium pump. The cell membrane has an extensive Na plus K plus ATPase system that hydrolyzes ATP and uses the released energy to transport sodium ions out of the cell into the interstitium. At the same time, potassium is transported from the interstitium into the interior of the cell. So the operation of this ion pump in the basolateral membrane maintains low intracellular sodium and high intracellular potassium concentrations and creates a net negative charge of about minus 70 millivolts within the cell. This active pumping of sodium out of the cell across the basolateral membrane of the cell favors passive diffusion of sodium across the luminal membrane into the cell. From the luminal membrane of the cell, from the lumen into the cell, for two reasons. One, there is a concentration gradient favoring sodium diffusion into the cell because intracellular sodium concentration is low, that is about 12 milliequivalents per liter. And also the tubular fluid sodium concentration is high, 140 milliequivalents per liter. And the second reason is the negative minus 70 millivolts in the cell, the intracellular potential, it attracts the positively charged sodium ions from the tubular lumen into the cell. Active reabsorption of sodium by the sodium potassium ATPase occurs in most parts of the tubule. In the proximal tubule, there is an extensive brush border on the luminal side of the membrane that multiplies the surface area to about 20-fold. There are also carrier proteins that bind sodium ions on the luminal surface of the membrane and release them inside the cell, providing facilitated diffusion of sodium through the membrane into the cell. Okay, now these sodium carrier proteins are also important for secondary active transport of other substances as we'll discuss later. Thus, the net reabsorption of sodium ions from the tubular lumen back into the blood involves at least 3 steps. Sodium diffuses across the luminal membrane or the apical membrane into the cell down an electrochemical gradient established by the sodium potassium ATPase pump on the basolateral side of the membrane. Sodium is transported across the basolateral membrane through via the Na plus K plus ATPase pump. Sodium, water, and other substances are reabsorbed from the interstitial fluid into the peritubular capillaries by ultrafiltration or bulk flow, a passive process driven by the hydrostatic and colloid osmotic pressure gradients. Coming to secondary active reabsorption through the tubular membrane, in secondary active transport, two or more substances interact with a specific membrane protein or a carrier molecule and are transported across the membrane together. As one of the substances, for instance sodium, diffuses down its electrochemical gradient, the energy released the energy released is used to drive another substance against its electrochemical gradient, as you can see here. So in this picture you can see the Na plus K plus ATPase, what it does is it causes sodium to move out of the cell. As intracellular sodium is low, the sodium moves along with glucose into the cell. So this is what happens in secondary active transport. So the secondary active transport does not require energy directly from ATP or other high energy phosphate sources. Rather, the direct source of the energy is that liberated by the simultaneous facilitated diffusion of another transported substance down its electrochemical gradient. So in both instances, specific carrier proteins in the brush border combine with a sodium ion and an amino acid or a glucose molecule at the same time. These transport mechanisms are so efficient that they remove virtually all the glucose and amino acids from the tubular lumen. After entry into the cell, the glucose and amino acids exit across the basolateral membranes by diffusion. Coming to SGLT1 and SGLT2, which are sodium glucose co-transporters, they are located on the brush border of the proximal tubular cells and carry glucose into the cell cytoplasm against a concentration gradient. Okay, they are located in the brush border. Now, approximately 90% of the filtered glucose is reabsorbed by SGLT2 in the S1 segment of the proximal tubule or the early part of the proximal tubule, and the residual 10% is transported by SGLT1 in the later segments of the proximal tubule. First, it is SGLT2, next it is SGLT1. On the basolateral side of the membrane, glucose diffuses out of the cell into the interstitial spaces with the help of glucose transporters. GLUT2 in the S1 segment and GLUT1 in the latter part, that is the S3 segment of the proximal tubule. Now, although transport of glucose against a chemical gradient does not directly use ATP, the reabsorption of glucose depends on energy expended by the primary active sodium-potassium ATPase pump in the basolateral membrane. Because of the activity of the sodium-potassium pump in the basolateral membrane, which hydrolyzes ATP to drive sodium out of the cell against an electrochemical gradient, there is an electrochemical gradient set up for the carrier proteins such as SGLT1 and 2 to transport sodium along with an associated glucose or amino acid molecule into the cell. Okay, so an electrochemical gradient for facilitated diffusion of sodium across the luminal membrane is maintained because of the activity of sodium-potassium ATPase pump in the basolateral membrane. And it is this downhill diffusion of sodium into the interior of the cell that provides the energy for the simultaneous uphill transport of glucose across the luminal membrane. Okay. So another important point is that a substance is said to undergo active transport when at least one of the steps in the reabsorption process involves primary or secondary active transport, even though other steps in the reabsorption process may be passive. For glucose reabsorption, secondary active transport occurs at the luminal membrane, but passive facilitated diffusion occurs at the basolateral membrane, and passive uptake by bulk flow occurs at the peritubular capillaries. Coming to secondary active secretion into the tubules, we can understand this via countertransport. In countertransport, the energy liberated from the downhill movement of one of the substances, such as sodium ions, enables the uphill movement of a second substance in the opposite direction. One example is the coupling of active secretion of hydrogen ions with the sodium reabsorption in the luminal membrane of the PCT. In this case, sodium entry into the cell is coupled with hydrogen extrusion from the cell by the sodium-hydrogen countertransporter. This transport is mediated by a specific protein, sodium-hydrogen exchanger or antiporter, in the brush border of the luminal membrane. Coming to penocytosis, which is also called cell drinking, it is an active transport mechanism for reabsorption of proteins. In some parts of the tubule, especially the proximal tubule, they reabsorb large molecules such as proteins by penocytosis, which is a type of endocytosis. In this process, the protein attaches to the brush border of the luminal membrane, and this portion of the membrane then invaginates into the interior of the cell until it is completely pinched off and a vesicle is formed containing the protein. Once inside the cell, the protein is digested into its constituent amino acids, which are reabsorbed through the basolateral membrane into the interstitial fluid. Because penocytosis requires energy, it is considered a form of active transport. And coming to transport maximum, for most substances that are actively reabsorbed or secreted, there is a limit to the rate at which a solute can be transported, which is often referred to as a transport maximum. This limit is due to saturation of the specific transport systems involved when the amount of solute delivered to the tubule, that is referred to as tubular load, exceeds the capacity of the carrier proteins and specific enzymes involved in the transport process. See, normally measurable glucose does not appear in the urine because essentially all the filtered glucose is reabsorbed in the proximal tubule. You can see here. As the plasma glucose concentration keeps increasing, the filtered load and also the reabsorption of glucose keeps increasing. Okay. In the adult human, transport maximum for glucose averages about 375 mg per minute. So in the filtration reabsorption curve of glucose, the value corresponding to the y-axis, that is glucose filtered load or reabsorption. When it reaches 375 mg per minute, that is called the tubular maximum for glucose, which means that more than this, the glucose cannot be filtered. Okay, it starts being excreted at the x-axis value of about 250 mg per minute, which is called the renal threshold for glucose. Okay, renal threshold means the point at which glucose starts appearing in the urine. So when this value is reached, the glucose starts appearing in the urine, that is excretion of glucose begins. Okay, so in the adult human, transport maximum for glucose averages about 375 mg per minute, whereas filtered load of glucose is only about 125 mg per minute. With large increases in GFR or plasma glucose concentration that increase the filtered load of glucose above 375, the excess glucose filtered is not reabsorbed and passes into the urine. Okay, so however, when the plasma concentration of glucose rises, till it rises till 200, if it rises, the filtered load and reabsorption of glucose rise proportionately. But when the plasma concentration of glucose rises about 200 mg per deciliter, increasing the filtered load to about 250 mg per minute, a small amount of glucose then begins to appear in the urine. This point is known as the threshold for glucose. See, here you can see a splay in the glucose reabsorption curve. One reason for the difference between threshold and transport maximum, or the reason for the splay, is because not all nephrons have the same transport maximum for glucose. Some of the nephrons therefore begin to excrete glucose even before others have reached their transport maximum. The overall transport maximum for the kidneys, which is normally about 375 mg per minute, is reached when all the nephrons have reached their maximal capacity to reabsorb glucose. The plasma glucose of a healthy person almost never becomes high enough to cause glucose excretion in the urine, even after eating a meal. However, in uncontrolled diabetes mellitus, the plasma glucose may rise to high levels, causing the filtered load of glucose to exceed the transport maximum, resulting in urinary glucose excretion. Okay. And then coming to calculation of tubular reabsorption or secretion from renal clearances. See, we can understand this concept like this. For example, if the rate of excretion of the substance UV is less than the filtered load of the substance GFR into P, then some of the substances must have been reabsorbed from the renal tubules. Okay, so think of it like this: GFR equals UV by P. Okay, so if GFR, what is see, for example, if you can understand it with this formula. See, urinary excretion. If tubular reabsorption increases, your urinary excretion decreases. And then if your tubular secretion increases, your urinary excretion increases, and GFR increases, your urinary excretion increases. Okay. So if conversely, if the excretion rate of the substance is greater than its filtered load, then the rate at which it appears in the urine represents the sum of the rate of glomerular filtration plus tubular secretion.